Chapter 19. The Decline of Formalities. Remnants of the old system. The requirement of registration. For centuries, the great theft of intellectual property wasn't an automatic right, but a bureaucratic ritual. If you wished to build a legal fence around your idea, you had to perform a physical act of submission to the state. You had to leave the sanctuary of your study, walk to a government office, such as the soot-stained Stationers' Hall in London, or the marble halls of the Library of Congress in Washington, and pay a fee to have your claim entered into a heavy leather-bound ledger. Without the official stamp, the wax seal, and the chronological entry in the registry, your work was considered part of the commons, free for anyone to take, harvest, and sell, much like the unpicked berries in a communal forest. These formalities were the last surviving echoes of the medieval privilege system, a time when ownership was a grace and not an entitlement. They served as a vital filter of intent, ensuring that only those who intended to commercialize their work and who respected the state's authority to grant such a monopoly could claim a fence. In this reality, the public domain was the default state of existence. If a writer forgot to include a copyright notice, failed to deposit a physical copy of their book, or neglected to renew their registration after a set number of years, the fence simply dissolved. The work fell back into the common soil, becoming the shared property of humanity. This conditional property meant that the vast majority of human expression, private letters, ephemeral pamphlets, sketches, and amateur songs, remained open and shared. The legal enclosure was reserved for the heavyweights of industry. However, as the 19th century progressed, the powerful publishing syndicates and the emerging corporate owners of mind began to view these registration requirements as irritating hurdles and traps for the unwary. They argued that a man should not lose his natural right simply because a clerk forgot to ink a stamp. What they truly desired, however, was a world where the fence was invisible and inescapable. The great theft was seeking to shed its bureaucratic skin and become an atmospheric condition of life, where ownership was no longer a conscious act, but an automatic consequence of creation. 2. The 1886 Berne Convention and International Uniformity. The year 1886 marked the construction of the most ambitious and expansive global fence in human history, the Berne Convention for the Protection of Literary and Artistic Works. Under the soaring, romantic leadership of Victor Hugo, who viewed the author as a world citizen whose property should know no borders, representatives from the world's major powers gathered in the quiet city of Bern, Switzerland. Their mission was to end the era of intellectual sovereignty and replace it with a synchronized international regime of ownership. Before Berne, the great theft was a fragmented, local affair. A book protected in London could be pirated in the United States or Belgium without legal consequence, as these nations acted as intellectual frontier lands that refused to recognize foreign fences. The Berne Convention brought this frontier to a close. It established the revolutionary principle of national treatment, which dictated that every signatory nation must protect the works of foreign authors exactly as they protected their own. In this landscape, the fence became a phantom that crossed oceans and mountain ranges. An author no longer owned a British right or a French right, but a global right. This was the birth of international uniformity, a process that smoothed out the rugged terrain of local laws into a flat, predictable surface for corporate expansion. The Berne Convention ensured that the great theft was no longer a series of skirmishes between local printers, but a unified global empire of control. By standardizing the duration and scope of protection, it ensured that the commons of the mind was being enclosed at the same rate in every corner of the civilized world. It was the ultimate victory of the property class, a world where an idea, once enclosed in Paris, was instantly and legally fenced off in the furthest reaches of the colonial empires. 3. Why formalities fell out of favor in the 19th century. As the 19th century drew to a close, a radical shift in legal philosophy transformed the formalities of the old system, registration, notice, and deposit, from protective rituals into repressive burdens. Jurists, heavily influenced by the German personality interest, began to argue that requiring an artist to register their work was as absurd as requiring a person to register their own shadow. They claimed that property was a natural right of the soul, and that the state had no business placing hoops through which a genius must jump. However, beneath this romantic rhetoric lay the cold, hard logic of industrial efficiency. The late 19th century was the era of the mass-produced newspaper, the high-speed telegraph, the burgeoning recording industry. In this world of lightning-fast communication, the sheer volume of creative output was staggering. If a newspaper had to register every single article, or a photographer every single frame, the bureaucratic machinery would grind to a halt. The publishing industry demanded a system where the fence moved as fast as the press. They viewed the old formalities as traps for the unwary that allowed valuable property to accidentally slip back into the public domain. The great theft was evolving. It no longer wanted to be a deliberate, conscious legal act. It wanted to be instantaneous and invisible. The decline of formalities was the moment the property system abandoned the ledger for the atmosphere, ensuring that the enclosure was no longer a task for the creator, but an automatic, unavoidable condition of the act of creation itself. 4. The shift to automatic protection for authors. The most profound and chilling transformation brought about by the decline of formalities was the move to automatic protection. This was the moment the fence became an atmospheric phenomenon. Under this new doctrine, copyright was born at the very microsecond of fixation. The moment a poet's ink touched a page, the moment a composer's fingers struck a piano key, or the moment a shutter clicked in a camera. The law automatically and silently erected a fortress around that expression. This was the ultimate victory of the property concept. It turned the entire planet into a minefield of invisible ownership. While the proponents of Berne framed this as a victory for the dignity of the author, its primary effect was to drastically and violently shrink the public domain. Because everything was now protected by default, the commons was no longer the vast open ocean in which humanity swam. It became a series of tiny, shrinking islands. In this reality, the burden of proof was flipped on its head. In the old world, the work was free unless the owner proved otherwise through a registration stamp. In the new world of automatic protection, everything is stolen until proven free. This meant that the shared cultural heritage of the past, the stories, songs, and images that form our collective memory, was now encased in a legal amber. The great theft had successfully moved from the physical world into the very act of thinking, ensuring that no modern creator could build upon the past without first navigating a labyrinth of phantom owners and invisible fences. 5. The modern rejection of directory versus conditional registration. In our modern legal era, we have seen a total and absolute rejection of what 19th century jurists called conditional registration. In the past, the law was directory. It gave you clear directions on how to protect your work. Register it, pay the fee, print the symbol. And if you failed to follow those directions, the work was a gift to the public. Today, the world follows a no formalities rule that has turned the public domain into an accidental territory rather than a deliberate one. This explores the grim consequence of this seamless enclosure, the crisis of orphan works. Because registration is no longer required, we now live in a world filled with millions of books, photographs, films, and songs that are legally fenced in, yet whose owners are unknown, dead, or impossible to find. These works are trapped in a legal no man's land, too modern to be in the public domain, yet too obscure to be licensed. The great theft has become so efficient that it has locked up the recent past so tightly that the keys themselves have been lost. By rejecting the condition of registration, we have ensured that the common source of our shared history is increasingly out of reach. We inhabit a reality where property is automatic, perpetual, and global, leaving the modern citizen trapped in a world where almost every scrap of culture is a private estate, and the common speech of humanity is being systematically transcribed into a private ledger of debt.